In this video, we're going to continue our study in the Gospel of John. This is our online class now that we can't meet for a few weeks. I hope everyone continues to do well and that you're being safe from this horrible virus that is going around. Um, this video may be a little longer than the previous ones that I've done because what I'd like to do is cover the section in John's Gospel here where Jesus stands before Pilate. It's the end of chapter 18 and the beginning of chapter 19. So this one may go a little longer. If it's longer than you want to do in one sitting, obviously you can just stop it whenever you want and continue at your leisure. That's the nice thing about these videos. Unlike a class where you can't tell the teacher that I've had enough now, let's do this later. um, uh, this you can stop anytime. So we'll continue on with our study. We're going to pick up in John chapter 18 and verse 28. And we noted a couple things about this right at the end of our previous study, but I wanted to kind of go over that just a little bit. I think I found a little, some better resources to think about. So uh, here, if we look at this map is by Shimon Gibson. He's an archaeologist who has published a few things about this particular site in Jerusalem, and he is the one who is probably most notably advocated that this is the original site of the trial of Jesus. Remember, there's another place on the northern side of the city that is traditionally the site, but most scholars believe that it doesn't really fit the description well, and that Pilate would not have been at the barracks of the soldiers, which was up there on the north side of the city. This site seems to fit much better. So you see on the map here um, that you have the palace used by Herod Antipas, and then you have the praetorium here. So this is Herod the Great's old palace. This is where Pilate would have been staying when he was in Jerusalem. And then right outside of that is this place here that Shimon Gibson calls the Gate of Judgment. And so those are the areas that are involved in this story on the western side of the city here. The traditional site is up here at the Antonia Fortress, and this map doesn't show that very, very well. We think it was probably a bigger structure than what is shown on this map. But Gibson says that everything happened down here instead, and I think that that's probably the much more likely thing. I think Gibson is probably right about that. So this is a drawing from one of the essays that Gibson has published about this. It is his reconstruction of what this side of the city looked like along the outer wall. So here you can see this building up here in the top of the picture. That would have been Herod's palace, or what is now called in Jesus' day Pilate's praetorium, where the Roman officials stayed when he was in town. And then this judgment scene or judgment seat place is right here. You see the Gate of the Essenes, and John later on in the text that we're looking at here says that it was at a place called the Pavement, and in Hebrew it is called Gabbatha. We can go down there here in 1913 that Pilate sat down at a place called the Pavement here, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. John is not saying that the Aramaic word Gabbatha means pavement. What he says there is that it is a place called the Pavement, but the Jews called it something else. The Jews called it Gabbatha, and Gabbatha is a word of uncertain origin. It probably means something like the height or the ridge. So you can see in the drawing here that there is this kind of elevated platform here with some steps going up to it. And that may be why they called it this, because it was an elevated place or like a ridge along the city wall. Uh, Sounds like a good theory to me. This is another artist reconstruction of what that would have looked like. So again, we have the staircase. Pilate could go in and out from the praetorium here, and then there would have been this higher place here, and you can see in the drawing here a seat that would have been the official judgment seat that Pilate sat on as he rendered verdicts for the people. You may remember Jared has mentioned in several of his classes that judgments are done at places like city gates. And when the Romans come along, this is changed a little bit. Judgments happen in a place called the judgment seat. It would have been the official kind of chair of justice in a town, not necessarily at a city gate anymore, like in Old Testament times, but an official place of judgment that was associated with the local ruler. And so that's what you would see here in this drawing. And the idea is that the crowd then would have been out in front of this. So here again is a photograph of what it looks like now. You can see it's in ruins, but the steps would have gone up through here, through the wall, and into the praetorium, and that raised platform, what's left of it, is right here. And so this is kind of the broad view, the doorway somewhere in here, the raised platform along here. And so if you can imagine the Jews standing out in this area here, this area would have been the pavement, and this is where I think the trial of Jesus happened. So we'll leave that picture up as we get back into the text here, and we'll go back to chapter 18 and verse 28. So here we have the initial presentation of Jesus to Pilate at the site that you see in the photograph, I think. The scene that is presented here is a little bit confusing. John presents it as a scene in which people are frustrated, people, especially Pilate, are confused, and there are many questions that we have about the nuances that were present in this original situation that we just don't have answers for. So, for example, uh, did the Jews really force Pilate into killing Jesus? That's kind of a standard interpretation among New Testament scholars that is held for a long time. But in more recent times, some scholars have come to question that. Could the locals in a place like Jerusalem really have been persuasive enough? Could they have bullied, a Roman procurator into doing something? For many historians, that idea is just simply absurd. This is not how the Romans did business, by letting the locals push them around. And so some scholars have come to say, this traditional way of thinking about the trial of Jesus may not be the best way to think about that. In tandem with that, some scholars have suggested that maybe what we're looking at here, rather than the Jews kind of pressuring Pilate into doing something, maybe what we're looking at here is Pilate toying with them, Pilate stringing them along, because in the ancient world, these kinds of scenarios were always power plays. They were contests, as it were, to see who it is that could win in the end of this situation. And so you have these local Jewish leaders who have their own kind of sphere of authority among the people. And then you've got Pilate, who is the civil authority. And they're both kind of jockeying for who's really in control and who's going to get their way in this situation. There's kind of a negotiation going on in the text here, a play for power. And many scholars think that what Pilate may be doing really is toying with them, uh, trying to put them in their place, as it were, and remind them of where the real authority lies. But we also see in this scene a lot of back and forth. Pilate speaks to Jesus, he speaks to the Jews, he speaks to Jesus, speaks to the Jews. There's this back and forth. And this is kind of accompanied by this spatial thing going on in the narrative where Pilate is in the praetorium and then he's out with the crowd, in and out, back and forth, one group to another, one position to another. And so there is this kind of built in uncertainty in the narrative, this vacillation that imagine if you are reading or hearing this story for the first time, you wouldn't know how it's going to end. What's he going to do? Where's he gone now? Who's he talking to? What's he thinking? All of these things are kind of left up in the air. And I imagine that that is a pretty decent reflection of the original scene, that for a while it wasn't clear what was going to happen to Jesus and who was going to do what. But in the end, of course, Pilate is going to accomplish the will of God. That cannot be thwarted. But for all of his displays and all of his authority, Pilate comes across as reluctant. We're even going to see later on in the text that John says that he was afraid. So, how did he come to his final decision? That will be something we want to kind of keep an eye on as we're going through this text. So, if we come over here to verse 28, they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. So, it's early in the morning, and later on, we're going to hear later on in this chapter um, that it was about the sixth hour here in chapter 9 and verse 14. So we have to understand that the events that we're looking at here take a couple of hours. Even though it's only a few verses in the gospel, we have to understand that this is most of the morning where this back and forth and this posturing is all happening. And maybe that adds kind of a sense of how real this is in the narrative. The frustration begins. It says that the Jews did not enter themselves into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but because the Passover is coming up. And they don't want to be unclean, because if you become unclean, you have to wait, and you can't eat the Passover while you're in that waiting period and still unclean. So the Jews believed, as we've noted in the book of Acts, that if you go into the house of a Gentile, that makes you unclean. Remember Peter's reluctance to go to the house of Cornelius. So here the Jews have this same kind of reluctance. They don't want to go into this pagan abode in their city here. So they are outside and they call Pilate to come out. Now, what's kind of interesting about the story here is that there are several obstacles in the way of the Jews. First of all, they need to get in touch with Pilate. But because of the circumstances, they can't go in there. They won't go in there. And then, of course, there is the problem, as we're going to see in the narrative, that they want Jesus dead, but he hasn't broken any Roman laws. And Pilate keeps saying over and over, he hasn't done anything wrong. So there is this legal obstacle as well. And what this does is kind of showcases the determination of the Jewish leaders. That even though the case is kind of stacked against them, they're going to be very persistent. And in the end, of course, they are going to get their way. And there is an irony that comes up in the text here. All kinds of irony accumulates in the story. We've seen this in the narrative before, ironic things that happen, but it really piles up here in the story of the trial of Jesus before Pilate. And so here it says that they didn't want to be defiled because they want to eat the Passover that is coming up. And yet the whole purpose of this effort on their part is to commit murder. And you talk about something morally defiling, murder is it. And so ritually they want to stay clean, but they don't have this sense of the moral problem of what they're doing. As a matter of fact, they think that they are actually doing right. Caiaphas, we've heard talk before in the narrative, of course, thinks that he's going to avert a national catastrophe by killing Jesus. That if we let Jesus go on, everybody will follow him, the Romans will come and kill us all. And so Caiaphas is thinking about his own place, his own position, his own safety. And the irony of that, of course, is that by killing Jesus, he will bring the wrath of God upon this city. But of course, he doesn't understand any of that. The irony at the moment is that they want to murder Jesus, and yet they do not want to become unclean. So Pilate, verse 29, comes out and says, what's the problem here? What accusation? What are the charges? And their answer to Pilate is rather interesting. If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. If we were to put that in our own words, they're saying, who cares what he's done? All we need for you to do is to crucify him. What are you asking us about the charges for? He's obviously done something. We wouldn't be here talking to you if there wasn't something amiss with this man. We've already determined his guilt. We just want you to put him to death. This is kind of insulting language to speak this way to this Roman official. Don't you mind about that. We've already taken care of those details. We don't need you to try this case. We don't need your involvement. You butt out of this, as it were, and just do your job, is what they're saying to this Roman official. And of course, what they want is the rubber stamp, but they're also, of course, trying to protect themselves. Because in this particular case, we understand that if they do explain the case to Pilate, that Pilate may well dismiss it. That if the only thing they've got is that, well, this man has broken Jewish law, Pilate's going to say, that's not my concern. I'm not going to execute somebody for breaking your law. If he's broken Roman law, then we can talk, but I'm not going to execute anybody for breaking Jewish law. Now, of course, there could be some leeway in that. I mean, local Roman officials and local officials could cooperate in capital cases. But the tensions are always high in this part of the Roman Empire. Jews hate the Romans are not fond of the Jews, and so you get this verbal sparring going on, this language of contempt directed in both directions. And so they're making their power play, as it were, here. They're going to see if they can't just get this pushed through and if Pilate will cooperate. Of course, Pilate is insulted. In verse 31, Pilate says, well, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. If you think he's guilty, then you go and judge him according to your law. And of course, Pilate knows that he has the upper hand here when it comes to the death penalty. The Jews are not allowed to put anybody to death. They say so in verse 31, we're not permitted to do this. We need you to do this for us. And so what Pilate has done is thrown it back in their face, saying, you don't talk to me that way. You want my help, then you come here with a different tone. And if you want him executed, then you go and execute him and see what happens then, because the Jews were not allowed to do that. So Pilate is kind of telling them, you're going to have to play nice. You're going to have to show some respect here. You don't come to me, you don't come to my house and talk to me this way. This is not how business is done here. If you want me to help you do something, then you talk to me with respect. And you can hear the tension in the air as you listen to these words of back and forth. They need Pilate's cooperation, and Pilate is reminding them of this. It might surprise us that the Jews are talking this way to Pilate when obviously they need Pilate's cooperation. Wouldn't they be nicer to him? And I think the answer to that question may lie in something we mentioned a moment ago, in the mutual contempt that these people have for each other. That they are not friends. They do not cooperate normally in anything. That both of them view each other uh, as people that they have to deal with only because they are in this situation, but otherwise they would have nothing to do with each other. And so Pilate here uh, has been kind of affronted. The Jews want to take control of this situation. Now Pilate has to respond. He can't look weak. He has to remind them that, hey, I'm the one in control of this situation around here. They say in verse 31 there, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. And the way that this is worded brings up some interesting things. You remember in the book of Acts that the Jews do kill Stephen. So, could they or couldn't they? And twice before in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 59, and again in chapter 10 and verse 31, John said that the Jews picked up stones and were ready to stone Jesus to death. So what's going on here? And there have been several answers that have been suggested. Some have suggested that sometimes the Jews did kill people in mob type situations, and the Romans would look the other way as long as it didn't get out of hand. Some scholars have suggested that on occasions the Jews were willing to risk getting in trouble with the Romans when their passions were high enough. Other explanations, that the Jews were allowed to kill people on religious charges, but not on civil charges. We just don't know with sufficient clarity exactly how all of this worked. So there's kind of that ambiguity in the background here. But you'll notice how they say this: we're not permitted to put anyone to death. And in English, it kind of smooths over an interesting difference in the original Greek here. In the law of Moses, of course, we have this law that says, thou shalt not kill. Now, the law of Moses did allow for executions. There are capital crimes in the law of Moses, and they are not considered to be violations of the command, thou shalt not kill. And the word that the Jews have used here is not the word for execute. It's the word for kill. We are not allowed to kill anyone. That's an interesting choice of words on their part. And so the law of Moses says they're not allowed to kill, but ironically, this is exactly what they're going to do. They're going to kill Jesus. And we've been told about this over and over and over again in the narrative, that they wanted to kill Jesus. So it's an interesting way that this works out. And we're going to see this again in the narrative, where the Jews kind of say something that is kind of revealing their motives. That here, we would expect them to have said, well, Pilate, we need an execution. But that's not what they said. We're not allowed to kill anyone. Kind of a slip of the tongue there a little bit, revealing their true motives. And it's like this former irony where they know that what they're doing is wrong, that it is defiling, and yet they are going to do it anyway. They have their minds set on this. John notices in verse 32 on the screen there that all of this winds up fulfilling Jesus' own word. Over and over, chapter 3, verse 14, chapter 8, verse 28, chapter 12, verse 32, Jesus has been talking about being lifted up. And of course, this is a reference to crucifixion. We saw that in John chapter 12. If I am lifted up from the earth, and John said Jesus was talking there about being crucified. So John sees the providence of God at work in this scene. The Jews are not going to execute Jesus. He's not going to be stoned to death because Jesus himself had predicted that he would be lifted up in crucifixion, and that word will be fulfilled as the Jews refuse to do this and put it on Pilate, who can, of course, lift Jesus up on a cross. But this creates another element of irony. By getting the Romans to kill Jesus, the Jews are going to confirm what Jesus said. And remember, according to the law of Moses, one of the tests of a true prophet is whether or not what he said would happen does happen. Only a true prophet can accurately predict the future. That is evidence that God has spoken through a man, because only God knows the future. So by handing Jesus over to the Romans, they will actually confirm that Jesus is the prophet who is sent from God. And remember the text in Deuteronomy, the Lord God will send you a prophet like me, Moses said, and you had better listen to him. And so by doing this, they condemn themselves. They show that Jesus was indeed a prophet, and if he was a prophet, they should have listened to him. You remember this is how actually the story began in John chapter 1, when the Jews sent people from Jerusalem to ask, "Are you the prophet of John the Baptist?" They knew the prophet was coming. Jesus is that prophet, and by their own actions, they will prove that he is. So the irony is piling up. Well, in the text here, in verse 33, Pilate goes back inside and he wants to talk to Jesus. And he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So we have to understand that there's more going on in this narrative than we are told about. Like a lot of narratives in the Gospels, there is a compression of the events that is going on here. And obviously, this is what the Jews have said to Pilate, or at the very least, this is what is implied, because by bringing Jesus to Pilate, they have implied that there is some kind of violation of Roman law. And in this context, Pilate could have figured out that, well, this guy must be claiming to be a Jewish king. I think it's safe to say that Pilate would have known that the Jews expected a Messiah, an anointed one who was coming to reign over the Jewish people. And in the Roman world, if the Jews are expecting a king to reign over them, well, that means that they will be free from the rule of Rome, that Rome will not be ruling over them. So this prophecy, I think Pilate probably understood, was a threat to the Roman rule of Syria and Judea. And so we kind of see all of those dots being connected in the text here. And he asks him the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now remember, John has not told us about the Jewish trial of Jesus. He focuses only on the Roman trial. And so here we have what is the Roman interest, Jesus as a rival to Caesar. Well, in verse 34, Jesus asks what we might expect to be the logical question here. Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus basically responds, where did you get the idea to ask me that? You know, how did you come up with this? Now, I do believe that Pilate may have connected the dots, but Jesus is getting here, of course, at the real source of things, that this is what they've said, right? This is what the Jews have told you about me, right? So, what is, I think Pilate is saying, what's your stance here, Jesus? What is your real interest here? Jesus cuts to the issue of where Pilate had got this idea. And there's kind of a hint in Jesus' words. We're going to see it come out later in chapter 19, where Jesus kind of gets to Pilate to say, do you realize that maybe you're being played here? Are you asking me if I'm the king of the Jews because you understand what's going on? Or has somebody put you up to this? Now, of course, Pilate would have been very sensitive to those kinds of things. He has to maintain an aura of control here, and Jesus is putting his finger on this. And of course, Jesus is also pointing out the weakness of the Jewish case against him. The Jewish leaders knew that they probably wouldn't have enough popular support for what they're doing here. Because remember, we've seen in the narrative before that lots of people have begun to think that Jesus might be the Messiah. People are following after him. Caiaphas had said back in chapter 11 that if this goes on, everybody's going to go after him. We saw the Jews debating in chapter 11, see, the whole world has gone after him. So the Jews know that they've got kind of an unpopular case here, and that they need the Romans to do that. And I think Jesus is kind of saying to Pilate, you do realize what's going on here, right? That you're a pawn in the game that they are playing. So Pilate says, okay, I'm not a Jew, am I? Verse 35. What do I care about what they think about things that are going on? Your law, your expectations, your prophecies are not a concern to me. Here's what I'm seeing, that there's something wrong someplace. Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you to me. So tell me, what's going on here? What have you done? What kind of trouble have you stirred up? Why are they so angry at you? Something has obviously happened here. And Pilate is saying to Jesus, I want your version of the situation. So Jesus says in verse 36, these famous words, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Well, Pilate probably didn't understand any of that. And this, of course, is typical for the story that we've been looking at, right? Nobody has understood Jesus in this narrative. When Jesus does say spiritual things, people misunderstand him. So there's really no reason to think that Pilate really gets all of this. Pilate does catch one thing, though, in verse 37. Oh, you are a king. This stuff about my kingdom not being of this world, who knows what that means, but you're some kind of king? Is that what you're telling me? And Jesus says, yes, verse 37, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who hears of the truth hears my voice. So Jesus says, yes, I am a king. I am a king of truth. as it were. I am building a kingdom of truth. And the people who hear my voice are those who are of the truth, and they come to me, and I reign over them in a kingdom based on the truth, not based on deception, like what's going on in the story here, not based on lies, but based on the truth spoken by Jesus from God. And Pilate says to him in verse 38, well, what is truth? And there's been a lot of debate over the centuries as to exactly what Pilate meant by that. Uh, Personally, I'm not convinced that Pilate is asking a kind of philosophical question here. That, well, what might truth be? What are the characteristics of truth? Where can we find it? I don't think that's what Pilate is saying here. My personal read on this story is that Pilate is beginning to understand that he is being played, that he is being treated like a pawn in a game. That's what Jesus has pointed out to him in verse 34 there. Pilate has admitted that, hey, I'm not a Jew. I'm not part of this. Tell me what's going on here. And because Pilate has been kind of deceived, he's been dragged into this thing and nobody is telling him what's going on. Remember, Pilate said, what's wrong here? What are the charges? And the Jews won't tell him. And now Jesus has pointed out to him that, you're being played here. Everything that Pilate has experienced so far since this story began has been a concealing of the truth from him. People not saying things. And even when Jesus speaks, of course, Jesus speaks the truth, but when Jesus speaks truth, it's over Pilate's head. He doesn't get it. And so when Pilate says, what is truth? I think Pilate is maybe a little bit exasperated here. Well, yeah, what is truth? The Jews have their story. You're telling me one thing. Who in the world knows what's really going on here? I think is what Pilate is saying here. That I haven't heard the truth all morning, and I've got to try to find out if I can what's going on. I got to get to the bottom of this. And yet, I think we have here in a roundabout way, kind of an admission of Pilate's own spiritual dullness. That Jesus has just spoken some pretty significant words to him. I am a king of a kingdom that is not of this world. We're not going to fight here. My servants are not going to try to break this up with swords and that kind of thing, because this is a different kind of kingdom, and I'm a different kind of king. And I've come into this world to start a kingdom of truth. Pilate doesn't get any of that. And so, for all the differences between Pilate and the Jews, Pilate is actually just like them. He cannot hear the voice of Jesus any better than the Jews have heard it. So, Pilate is getting kind of exasperated, maybe a little frustrated by now. And verse 38, he went out again to the Jews. So here is that in and out, back and forth that we've seen and that I mentioned before. And he says in verse 38, I find no guilt in him. I don't know what he's done. You won't tell me what he's done. There doesn't seem to be any Roman law broken here. Jesus says he's a king, but he's a king that is not of this world. So if he wants to play king in his head and imagine this fantasy kingdom, that's fine with me until he breaks Roman law. He hasn't done anything wrong. Now, of course, a couple of things about this. This is important. Here we have Pilate vindicating Jesus. And we're going to see it again before this story is over. But also, I think you can make the case that Pilate is again trying to remind them of who's in control. You don't come into my house and tell me to rubber stamp some kind of death penalty. I'll just let him go. And then we'll see who's in control here, right? And this is Pilate pushing back in a sense. And I think, in a sense, it's kind of retaliation for the earlier remarks that the Jews had made against him. Pilate then, I think, further threatens. He says, tell you what, I think I know of a way that we can do this. You've got somebody here that has obviously done something wrong. I don't know what it is, but something's wrong here, obviously. But we have this custom. Every year, us Romans free one of our prisoners, one of the Jewish prisoners, political prisoner, just as kind of a show of goodwill, that we're not just here to execute anybody who disagrees with us. We will let somebody go as an expression of kindness. So every year at the Passover, we do this. So tell you what, why don't I just release Jesus? Why don't we just call the whole thing off? Why don't we just, let this go? And again, I kind of get the impression that Pilate is toying with them. He's got to know that the Jews want Jesus dead. Why they want him dead is not clear. But Pilate, I think, is again playing this political power card. That, tell you what, every year about this time I let one of your prisoners, why don't I let him go? And again, the account here is very condensed. This is the very first time we've heard about Barabbas. The other Gospels kind of fill in the details here that there was a notorious robber. Now, the word robber here is kind of misleading in English. When we think of robber, we think of somebody who is a thief, somebody who has robbed a bank, taken somebody's money, taken diamonds or something like that. But the better way to translate the Greek word here is with the modern word terrorist. That Barabbas is a terrorist, that he is one of these insurrectionists who has been trying to start a war with the Romans. He's been one of these people, and Josephus tells us about a bunch of these people in the first century who was leading or part of a movement to overthrow Roman control and to establish the kingdom of the Jews independently once again. So when it says Barabbas was a robber, that he's a murderer, he is a killer, he is a terrorist, he is a violent man. And in the other Gospels, we find out that what Pilate is trying to do here is stack the deck. That he says, well, I can release Jesus, or I can release this notorious criminal, this violent man who's going to get you in all kinds of trouble. And of course, he's thinking that, well, the Jews won't want this murderer on the streets. They'll pick Jesus. But as we know, it backfires on Pilate. All of that is kind of condensed here in this narrative. And they cry out for Barabbas. And so here, again, we have irony. Because Jesus is the Father's Son. He is the Son of God. And the name Barabbas means the Father's Son. Bar in Aramaic means son of. Abba is father. So Barabbas is the Father's son. Yet he is the son of the devil, in a sense. That he is a son of his true father, the devil. Remember earlier in the Gospel of John, Jesus talked about that Satan is a liar and a murderer from the beginning, and he implied that the Jews are really children of the devil. Well, Barabbas really is. Barabbas is kind of a symbol of them. He encapsulates them. They don't want the real Father's Son. They want another father. They want the devil. They want Satan as their father. And they make that choice very clearly here. So we noted at the beginning of our study that we have here a kind of a persistence on the part of the Jews that is on display. That even though there are all these obstacles and Pilate is pushing back, that they keep insisting on the death of Jesus. Well, I thought when I started that I might just go all the way through this story and go down through John chapter 19 and verse 15, but we've gone for over 45 minutes now, and I think that if I were to get into that in this video, that this video would probably go another hour. So um, this is about the time of one of our normal class periods. I think it would probably make a good break here, but we will continue on with this story, obviously, in chapter 19. Once again, I hope that everybody stays well and safe. Our prayers are with you all, and of course, keep us in your prayers as well.